I was preparing material to go and brief the public that we were expecting flooding in these cities and people had to start preparing for it. And the Deputy Commissioner of Police was coming to the press conference with me, and literally almost as we were walking into the press conference he said, "Premier, I just have to brief you. We have a very serious situation emerging in Toowoomba. We have very little detail because everybody who can is out on the front line." He said, "Premier, we are doing swift-water rescues in the main street of Toowoomba." And a cold chill just went through me. This is a very pretty regional city on the top of a mountain. So the idea that just that sentence, "we're doing swift-water rescues in the main street of Toowoomba," told everybody immediately that something extreme and bizarre was happening.
An incredible example of the power of water. How much force it can have, like how it can just take cars and throw them down the river. It's pretty humbling just to show, you know, there's so much stuff that controls us.
In the floods of Rockhampton and Theodore just a fortnight earlier, rising river levels could be monitored and warnings delivered well in advance. In Toowoomba's case, torrential monsoonal-like rain falling on an already saturated catchment left no time for evacuations.
When you get a wall of water moving down very quickly down through a valley, it carries all before it. It will completely destroy houses, take cars off roads, basically carrying all before it, rip trees out. It's one of the most powerful forces in nature.
Toowoomba sits high on the Great Dividing Range west of Brisbane. If the rain flooded the town at 600 metres, what was it going to do to the valleys below? In part 2 of Forecast for Disaster, La Nina strikes. Australia's extraordinary weather continues. The lessons to be learnt from her double-edged sword. Replenishing the agricultural belts of central and eastern Australia, but wiping whole towns off the map in the process.
This weather may break our hearts, and it is doing that, but it will not break our will.
Come the end of 2010, Australian farmers had seen one of their best years become one of their worst.
Really, I've never seen a situation where I've seen so many people so depressed. Because we'd been through the year, we'd grown such fantastic crops, and then we got to that point where we're about ready to harvest, and down she came.
Farmers like Andrew Wiedemann of Horsham in Victoria had lived through years of dry, suffered in the 2009 Black Saturday fires, and now were desperately harvesting before rising waters bogged tractors and ruined A-grade crops.
For some in the south part of Victoria, they haven't had an opportunity to get much harvest in at all, so the financial impact on them is massive. And I think, there, again, that emotional impact of, yes, we've spent all this money, grown a great crop, got to that point and copped all this rain, you think, gee, you know, how many times can we get belted and we've got to pick ourselves up again and move on.
How had it come to this? The answer, a weather pattern known as La Nina.
But during the rapid transition from El Nino to La Nina back in autumn of 2010, a lot of farmers were very happy. We had widespread rainfall through northern and eastern parts of the country, and the Murray-Darling Basin, which many call the food bowl of Australia, saw its wettest year on record through 2010, and that was after a succession of very dry years from 2001 onwards. But as the saying goes, it never rains, it pours, and in the end, many farmers had too much rainfall by the end of the year.
Climatologists point to a 10-year cycle of more dry, then more wet. It would appear we've just begun a time of more wet.
So there does seem to be in parts of eastern Australia a decadal cycle. In fact, the climatologists have given it a fairly grandiose title, the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation. We seem to go from more La Nina to more El Nino type effects from decade to decade. So It could be, if that cycle does hold, it does indicate that we could be in for a wetter decade than normal. We don't know this is true. It's only a statistical relationship yet, and we don't know what could cause that, but it's certainly an area of interesting research.
Meteorologists and weather reporters track the extremes of Australian weather, foretelling the events, witnessing them, then reporting on the aftermath.
With severe weather warnings for flash flooding issued for northern parts of Victoria.
Over the last 2 years, we've experienced the biggest weather extremes that you can in a country like Australia, only that they've all happened in such a short space of time. We have seen an enormous transformation in terms of the weather and, of course, our landscape as a result.
This sort of rain is going to lead to worse flooding than we even saw last week.
We have been living through extraordinary times. Virtually every single week, we are breaking records for something. Whether it's rainfall or temperature, 100-year records are being broken, and they're really important as a benchmark because it allows us to appreciate just how significant these weather events are.
2010 has been nothing short of extraordinary in terms of rainfall across Queensland.
Over the last couple of years, we have literally experienced every extreme in Australian weather. Not only has this been extraordinary as a meteorologist and as a weather presenter, but I think these are years that Australians will never, ever forget.
The intense rains dealt a deep psychological blow to those in the bush. Farmers like David Jones in the southwest of New South Wales had sunk their savings into their crops and lost a lot.
It's hard, real hard. Sorry. But yeah, it's not easy.
Severe thunderstorms developing.
Weather reporters witnessed physical signs of change. Formerly dry, even drought-affected parts of New South Wales and Victoria experiencing rains and flooding not seen for generations. But these weren't normal winter rains.
La Nina produces bursts of tropical rain down through eastern and central Australia, and more so than the normal wet season rains. It tends to produce repeats, continuous bursts of tropical rain that come down, carrying huge amounts of water, which we see as rain. The last time we saw a similar one to this was 1974, when of course we did see the similar type floods in Brisbane. So a strong La Nina really just produces tropical rain coming down much further. This particular one, we saw tropical rain even affecting northern parts of Tasmania, which is a much further southward movement than normal.
The last time conditions had been seen like this was 1974, a legendary year. It was the year of Cyclone Tracy. It was the year of the Brisbane floods. 1974 was also a year of La Nina.
We're always trying to look at the current situation and see how it does compare with what happened in the past. That's a very important function of what we do, and that enables us to get some sort of scale, some sort of importance on what's happening by comparing with the past. Looking at the past is a very important part of predicting the future, which sounds a bit strange.
In late 2010, many lessons were still being learned. La Nina was showing her hand, and she would continue to do so even more strongly just weeks later, when the flash flooding of southeast Queensland made headlines around the world. What meteorologists did know was that the weather system that brings dry to Australia, El Nino, had finished, and its wet opposite, La Nina, had started. They knew this by tracking an intricate tropical Pacific Ocean temperature pattern that affects every country on the Pacific Rim. Warm water oscillates across the tropical Pacific in irregular cycles. It's a complex system of trade winds, the rotation of the Earth, and the natural cycle of warming and cooling. Rains tend to follow the warmer water, so when warm waters are in the east, over towards South America, Australia can experience dry weather, a phase we now call El Nino. And this is the phase that had dominated Australia's weather patterns for more than a decade. In 2010, sea surface temperatures over the western equatorial Pacific warmed considerably, while those of the central Pacific cooled. This is what we know as La Nina, and she brought the rains.
I can't think of a worse place to be a farmer than Australia, because we do have the most variable weather right across the globe. During El Nino years we get severe droughts, during La Nina years we get heavy rain and flooding, and we get an El Nino and a La Nina around every 2 to 5 years, so they're a very common occurrence.
But 2010 had something else. Coinciding with the La Nina cycle was a separate, moisture-producing weather pattern, the negative Indian Ocean dipole. This occurs when the equatorial Indian Ocean is warmer on the Australian side than the African side. Together, these two moisture feeders drenched Australia.
Let's look at the reason why we're seeing this heavy rain, Tom. Basically, we've got plenty of moisture coming in off the Pacific Ocean and the Coral Sea, not to mention a trough.
Yeah, the moisture is pouring in and it's converging along the coast as well, these very moist onshore winds. So that's why we're seeing the torrential falls. It's almost the perfect setup for heavy rain.
Weather watchers like to draw from history to compare and contrast statistics. And 1974 stands out. A year of rain, floods and cyclones.
What we saw in 74 and 75 was the negative IOD and La Nina happening at the same time. If you look at the footprint of rainfall that we saw across the country during those 2 years and you compare it to 2010 and 2011, when we've got exactly the same climate patterns happening at exactly the same time, it is literally like a carbon copy, which is quite extraordinary. But when you think about it, you just can't imagine something as bad as 1974 happening again until it actually happens.
While many parts of New South Wales and Victoria saw their fair share of floods in late 2010, it was Queensland that was to experience La Nina at her worst. On Christmas Day and for 3 days after, rains drenched central Queensland, flooding the coast from Rockhampton to Bundaberg and inundating vast tracts of land all the way inland to Longreach. 2 weeks later, rain event after rain event had saturated southeast Queensland. Then on the 10th of January 2011, an extraordinary downpour centred on Toowoomba, creating a wall of water.
Whoa!
Toowoomba tragedy was basically the combination of three things altogether that happened over a very short time period. Firstly, we had the pre-existing saturation of the soil. The soil was a sponge that was totally full from previous rain. Any rain that fell further was just going to run off. Then we had high-intensity rainfall for at least an hour right across the area. The official figures were something like 60 millimetres for the hour, but we believe from conversations with viewers and also observing the wall of water that came through Toowoomba, it could have been much higher, even say up to 100 millimetres in an hour between the rain gauges. Then we had the topography of the area, which also focused the actual runoff and the rain into a small area. So those three things together gave us that disaster at Toowoomba.
The city sits astride the Great Dividing Range, 600 metres above sea level. The water had to go somewhere.
You're talking about intense rainfall over a large area that is then funneled into one small area. So you're getting these hundreds of millimetres of rain coming rushing down, and there's only one place for this water to go. And in this case, it seemed to be straight through a country town.
In fact, two country towns in particular that are now part of Australian weather history, Postman's Ridge and Grantham.
Well, Queensland is reeling this morning from the worst natural disaster in our history and possibly in the history of our nation.
On January the 10th, 2011, the full power of a La Nina generated rain event was revealed. Up to 100 millimetres fell in an hour on Toowoomba, and the water had no choice but to head down the escarpments. On the east side, the Lockyer Valley, sits the town of Grantham. SES volunteer Annette Fivefoot was dispatched to warn the town of flooding, but was confronted by this.
We came around the bend up there towards the town, and suddenly the driver stopped because we could see a shipping container sailing across the highway. It just felt totally unreal. It wasn't possible. It was just a shipping container wasn't supposed to be in the middle of the road, middle of the highway. But so it took a few seconds for it all to sink in that there was something terrible happening.
A severe weather warning for flash flooding had been issued for the area, but the utter ferocity of the water shocked everyone. The river rose metres in just minutes. Water seemed to be coming from everywhere, taking all before it.
Well, now 100 millimetres of rain in 1 hour. What would that feel like? Now, if you can think of the heaviest thunderstorm you've ever seen in your life, and you were standing outside in that for 1 hour, the thunderstorm didn't move for 1 hour, that's what 100 millimetres of rain feels like in 1 hour. Guaranteed to produce flash flooding.
What is that? Is that a
On the front veranda of the Grantham Hotel, they witnessed carnage.
The wall of water, and it is produced by very, very high intensity rainfall over a very small area. And then it's got nowhere to go except by gravity. And then you just get this very, very high volume of water that's accumulated very, very quickly, and it's running away downhill.
brick wall went.
You watch these storms, you watch these weather events, and more often than not you hear reports of trees down or, you know, a little bit of flash flooding, but that event was so... There was nothing to measure that against. It was the power of Mother Nature at her absolute worst.
There is now a major search and rescue mission in the Lockyer Valley. It is a mission that is being supplied by the Australian Defence Force, by police, by fire and rescue staff and by emergency workers.
Queensland Emergency dispatches helicopter rescue service, piloted by Mark Kempton.
Grantham was just a total shock. As we came over sort of the last of the little ranges between us and Grantham flying up the valley, we just saw an inland sea. 666, there was literally just a moving mass of items. There was cars floating away, there was trucks being washed away, there was shipping containers, there was water tanks being smashed around, bits of building and debris were pouring off. Everything that would normally be there was just totally destroyed and swept away, and nothing was going to stop that water from doing what it wanted to do. It was just an incredible force of nature that was just smashing anything in its path.
The Lockyer Valley also had intense rainfall on the 10th and the 11th of January. We had rain rates up around 60 millimetres per hour, but in between the stations which observed the rain rates, we probably had some areas that saw even higher totals. It's very unusual to get rain rates up at 60 millimetres per hour, but I guess what made this event catastrophic was that rain was falling on ground that was already saturated after Queensland went through its wettest spring and December on records.
Right hand low level. Accept right, make right hand low level.
Far below, people clung to their roofs in shock at the horror swirling around them. Among the rescued, a couple who are still counting their blessings. Ken and Frances' aunt saw the water rising around their Grantham home and took to their car to escape. They barely made it 500 metres.
So I headed up this road. I said, we're going to get out of this, we'll get out of this. But I didn't look up the road to see how high the water was. And this big wall of water hit us. Well, it lifted the ute up just like a balloon, eh? Just like there was nothing there.
The car was swept away. Ken and Frances dove out of the open windows into the raging waters.
We didn't realise how deep it was at the time because all we were worried about was saving our lives. And we were paddling in the water when we saw the ute completely submerged.
And that's where I was washed from there across in between these two trees here, and then we ended up in them trees over there, probably 20 foot up the tree.
Even up in the trees, they weren't safe. The debris that chopper pilot Mark Kempton could see from the air was smashing everything on the ground.
Look at the size, you can see. Well, this shipping container, I'd say, had missed me by 18 to 2 foot at the most, which would have devastated us, and the tree would have flattened us.
We could not see people that were like the ants that were trapped in trees. As we came towards a particular house to get a group of people off the rooftop, they actually started pointing towards the tree line. The rotor downwash made the tree branches spread slightly apart, and we could see two heads poking up from the water level, looking up at the aircraft, and we were just like absolutely shocked. Darren winched the cable back in, and Mark Turner, our rescue crewman, and one of the aunts came out.
First to be rescued from the saplings and raging waters was Francis, soaked to the bone, scared, considerably shocked and near exhaustion, but alive.
That was an incredible rescue, and probably the most daunting of all of them.
Ken was soon after. In all that afternoon, 43 people were airlifted to safety.
Unfortunately, I can confirm that just this morning we have a further death to add to the toll in the valley. We have a 13th victim has been found in a field near Grantham.
People knew that we were going to tell them whatever was happening, whether it was good, bad or ugly, and we weren't going to sugarcoat it, and we were going to tell them everything they needed to know, and they could have confidence in the information. And that, for me, it was a very big learning experience just about how important information is and how comforting it can be when people are facing the most terrifying prospects. To feel that they have some small control over this awesome power of Mother Nature.
You need look no further than Postman's Ridge, also east of Toowoomba, to know the terror of having no control. As the water started to rise, Charlotte Bull pulled out a camera phone.
I realised that it was coming up really way too fast, so I kept the video rolling while we ran inside. You can hear me in the video, and that's pretty horrible. I hate that. But at least I've got proof, because you can't understand it. You really can't understand it. Unless you live through it, you can't understand it.
Charlotte, her mother Catherine and father Barry bolted at the second floor of their brick home as their entire lives downstairs were washed away.
When the water came, it took everything that was outside and in the bottom story of the house went. There was nothing that could withstand it.
I had rung my mum and told her all the goodbyes and everything.
Sweetie, you don't want to be in there.
No, we want to be together. We want everybody together.
Charlotte Bull's video of her home being inundated gives a frightening first-hand glimpse into the horrors of flash flood. If you ever want to translate weather reports of rainfall figures and flash flood warnings into a mental image, this is it.
From a weather presenter's perspective, you're trained that anything over 30 mils in an hour is going to cause problems. When you're in the office, it's colours on a radar if you're looking at rainfall. You know that yellow is heavy rain. When it gets to red, it's really heavy rain. And if you start to get the blacks in there, then you've either got a torrential downpour or hail.
Oh my God, Barry's coming, he built us with all our...
On January the 10th, that black dot on the radar showing a torrential tropical downpour sat over Toowoomba for an hour.
Oh my God! You don't know if it's the end of the world, or you don't know what's happening around you. We didn't know Toowoomba was affected. We didn't know any of this.
We're useless against weather, and I think we have to respect that. And it doesn't matter how powerful we think we are, how much we can build and make and how strong we think we are, at the end of the day, if Mother Nature wants to flood us, she's going to flood us.
As we weep for what we have lost, and as we grieve for family and friends, and we confront the challenge that is before us, I want us to remember who we are. We are Queenslanders. We're the people that they breed tough north of the border. We're the ones that they knock down and we get up again.
A lot of the information that I was getting was information that was, tearing at my emotions, and I knew that it would tear at the emotions and the hearts of, everybody who heard it. We had parents whose children had been swept away in rivers who didn't know whether they were dead or alive. We had children whose parents were gone, and we had police and rescue workers unable to get into these places because the weather was so bad and the roads had all been blocked. And so we didn't know whether people were in difficult, life and death situations, and rescuers unable to get to them. These were just terrible, terrible times. On the one hand, yes, I knew that I had to keep myself together to get the information out and to give people confidence. But I didn't think it was, and it was a very emotional at a personal level, just as much for me as it was for everybody. I feel like it felt for a moment that the whole state, that everybody who was sharing in this event had a moment of when we were all just as fragile as one another. And I don't think I entirely separated my emotions from that. And, I think there was a moment when we all shared in what was an incredibly emotional time.
The Queensland SES, the Australian military, the police, specialist help and no end of volunteers can take a bow. Their efforts after the flood are impossible to fully appreciate until you've lost everything. Grantham Mayor Steve Jones has the unenviable task of rebuilding a whole community.
I think it's really important to be positive. You've got to organise things, make sure things work, and be really positive to people and give them some hope, because a lot of the people here have had really their whole lives devastated. They've lost loved ones, they've lost all their property, they've got no home, all those sorts of things. And the last thing they need is to see a leader that isn't giving them some hope, or someone that's finding it difficult themselves. And let's be honest about it. I mean, we all suffer through this, we all find it difficult, but I think you've really got to make sure, for the sake of others, you stand up and make it happen.
Some residents, like Ken and Fran, aren't. Their house condemned and fighting their insurance company over the definitions of the term flood will have to take what comes.
We've sort of lived here for 18 years, and at our age, it's not a nice experience. It's just been all taken away from us.
Something we worked for all our life, and now we've got nothing left.
Yeah. So anyway, we just have to wait and see what happens from here on in.
Others, like the Bull family, their house still standing, can look at the surrounding geography now and realise that, though rare, this is not the first flash flooding on the escarpments. They won't wait for the next.
It changes your life completely. Like an hour, a week before this, we're rolling along really nicely with everything in place. Now we look at a house, we don't even recognise any of this. This doesn't look like the old house. This looks like something different, as though we're staying in somebody else's place. Some days you just want to go back to your old house.
We weren't heroes. We didn't choose to do this. The only choice we've got now is to get away from here.
Rain is scary. When you hear it rain, you start to panic. People are like, oh, isn't it lovely? You listen to the rain on the roof and you lie in bed. Isn't that beautiful and tranquil? And you even get CDs of rain. And now when you hear rain, you can't sleep, you can't do anything. You're always looking at the creek now. You're thinking, all right, what's important downstairs that I'm going to lose this time?
Some wondered whether the extremes of this La Nina could in part be due to climate change. It's just too early to tell.